deals with international trade. Our goal in this chapter is to answer the following questions. What determines how much of a good a country will import or export? Who benefits from trade? Who does trade harm? Do the gains outweigh the losses? If policymakers restrict imports, who benefits? Who is harmed? Do the gains from restricting imports outweigh the losses? What are some common arguments for restricting trade, and do they have merit? From chapter 3, we saw that a country has a comparative advantage if it produces the good at lower opportunity cost than the other country. Countries can gain from trade if each exports the good in which it has comparative advantage. Let's look at determinants of trade. First, let's look at equilibrium without trade. In other words, only domestic buyers and sellers. The country is closed to the outside world, and only there is domestic buyers and domestic sellers. Equilibrium price and quantity is determined on the domestic market. Total benefits is consumer surplus and the producer surplus, as we saw back in chapter 7. Let's look at world price and comparative advantage. PW here is the world price of a good, the price that prevails in the world markets. PD is the domestic price without trade. If domestic price is lower than the world price, then domestic country has comparative advantage, or country therefore exports the good. If domestic price is higher than world price, then domestic country does not have comparative advantage. Country therefore imports the good. We are assuming that the country is a small country, and if it is a small country, it's a price taker. Its actions are so small relative to the world market that it does not have effect on the world price. When a small country engages in free trade, the world price is the only relevant price. Since it is very small, it cannot affect world price. In other words, it is a price taker. No seller would accept less than the world price because it can sell the good at the world price in world markets. And no buyer would pay more than the world price because actually they can buy the goods all they want at the world price. Let's look at a country that exports soybeans, and this is a typical demand and supply for soybeans market. Without trade, the domestic equilibrium is $4 and domestic quantity traded is 500. If this country opens up for trade and the price rises from $4 to $6, in other words, $6 becomes the world price, under free trade, domestic consumers will purchase 300. In other words, price will go up. Some people will fall off the market from 500 down to 300 because the price of this item is now higher. And domestic producers will be happy because they will now want to supply more. From 500, they will supply 750. Remember the law of supply? When price goes up, suppliers bring more to the market. And so there will be a surplus in this market. Since domestic consumers will buy 300 and domestic suppliers will supply 750, then there's going to be a surplus. And that surplus, this country is going to export. Now, let's look at consumer surplus and producer surplus, which is the benefits of trade. So, consumer surplus, if you remember chapter 7, was this area of the triangle. This yellow triangle is consumer surplus, and that is A plus B. And you also remember, without trade, area C would be the producer surplus. Okay, total surplus and uh, domestic trade or closed economy is A, B, and C. Now, when we open this market for trade, let us see what happens to consumer surplus. Consumer surplus now shrinks to A. In other words, prices have gone up, consumers have lost out a little bit, so the consumer surplus is A. But look at the producer surplus. Producers are benefiting because not only did they claim this area B from consumers, there's also a new area here called D. So that producer surplus is C plus B plus D. Total surplus, therefore, is A, B, C, and D. What is the gain from trade? There's a new area here. This triangle is gain from trade. It is some new benefit that has come only as a result of international trade. It was not there under closed economy. The gain from trade. Let's look at a active learning exercise. Without trade, domestic price is 3,000. As you can see, without trade, the domestic equilibrium was 3,000 and 400 was being sold in the market. In the world market, if this country is open for trade, price will fall from 3,000 to 1,500. Under free trade, how many TVs will the country export? And as you can see, 200 will be supplied. In other words, suppliers will drop out of this market, but more buyers will come into the market. So quantity demanded, as you read off the demand curve, is 600. Quantity supplied is 200. So identify consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus first let's look at it without trade and then look at it with trade and see if there's a benefit to trade. Under free trade, domestic consumers demand 600. That is where the demand is. Domestic producers supply 200. And then consumer surplus without trade is area A. Producer surplus without trade is C and B. When this economy is open for trade, total surplus is A, B, and C. But when this economy opens up for trade, look at what happened to consumers. Price have fallen from 3,000 to 1,500. This is the price of TV. Consumer surplus has increased. Consumers have benefited. Not only did they claim this B from producer surplus, but there's a new area here called D. So what's the producer surplus? Producers don't like it when price goes down, so they lose out. So here producers have lost out, and therefore producer surplus is that little area C. Consumers have benefited tremendously, as you can see, A, B, C, and D. Total surplus. What's the gain from trade? The gain from trade is again this area D, which is a triangle. Gain from trade. So, summary, the welfare effect of trade. When domestic price is lower than world price, the country tends to export the good. Consumer surplus will fall. In other words, consumers lose out. Producer surplus gain because the prices have gone up, but total surplus also rise. On the other hand, when domestic price is higher than world price, then the country will import this particular product. Consumer surplus increases, consumers benefit when domestic price falls, and producer surplus falls. Producers don't like it when price falls, but total surplus rises. This is key because when total surplus rises, then there is benefit to trade. Whether a good is imported or exported, trade creates winners and losers. As you can see, when price goes up, consumers lose, producers win. When price goes down, consumers win, producers lose. So trade will create some winners and losers, but the gains exceed the losses. That is the key to understanding that there is a net benefit to trade. Let's look at what experts say. Past major trade deals have benefited most Americans. Is that true? 93% of economists agree. Who disagrees? Nobody disagrees. 7% uncertain. So economists agree that trade is good. So, who are the winners and losers from trade? Other benefits of international trade. Consumers will enjoy increased variety of goods. Producers enjoy lower costs and can take advantage of economies of scale. Increased competition, which reduce market power. I remember market power is a source of market failure. And so anything that reduces market power is good for welfare. Enhanced flow of ideas facilitates the spread of technological advances around the world. Then why all the opposition of trade? Why is trade a very controversial issue? Well, the losers have more incentive to organize and lobby for restrictions or trade. Remember, trade creates winners and losers. Now, losses concentrated among small group of people who feel them very acutely. But the gains is spread thinly over many, many people who may not see how trade benefits them. The winners from trade could compensate the losers and still be better off. Such compensation, of course, rarely occurs, and that is why there is quite a bit of controversy around issues of trade. Let's look at tariff. There's a trade barriers that sometimes government uses to restrict trade. Tariff is tax on goods produced abroad and sold domestically. Under free trade, domestic price is going to be equal to the world price. And tariff on imports will raise domestic price above the world price by the amount of the tariff. So let's look at that example in the cotton market. Analysis of a tariff on cotton shirts. World price is $20. Under free trade, buyers will buy 80 and domestic sellers will supply 25. Obviously, there's a shortage. If sellers can only supply 25, but buyers want to buy 80, there's going to be a shortage, and that shortage is going to be the import. So this country is going to import 80 minus 25, which is 55. Now, tariff, the government comes in and imposes a tariff of $10 per shirt. Every time you buy a shirt, you pay a tax of $10. So a $20 shot all of a sudden is going to be $30 because you have to pay the tax. It will have the effect of reducing demand for the good from 80 to 70. Remember, the marginal buyer will fall off the market when price goes up. But it will have the effect of increasing domestic supply. The marginal sellers will enter the market. When tariff is imposed, it is protecting the sellers, and some people will rejoin, and so supply will increase from 25 to 40. So import will decline from 55 when there was no tariff to 30. So there's some measure of protection for the domestic suppliers here. So imports have declined, which was the goal of tariff. So let's look at the effect of tariff on welfare. Under free trade, consumer surplus is A, B, C, D, E, F. No tariff, consumers are benefiting because the price of cotton shirts are low, and so consumers are happy. But producers are not happy because the producer surplus is only G. Remember, producers are not happy when prices are low. There is foreign competition, so they can't compete with foreign goods. So the total surplus is A, B, C, D, E, F, G. With tariff, now let's say these producers gang together and ask the government to protect them, and the government agrees and imposes a tariff of $10. Now, consumers will lose because the price of a shirt will go up from 20 to 30. So consumer surplus will drop to this green area, A, B. In other words, consumers will lose this area here, C, D, E, F, which was consumer surplus before. Now it is A and B. Producer surplus increases from G to G and C. So producers, obviously, the tariff benefits producers. So producer surplus increases. Government also collects revenue. Remember, tariff is a tax on imports that is paid by people who buy imported material. So the tax is the area E. Area of this rectangle is the revenue that goes to the government. So what's the total surplus? A, B, C, E, and G. A, B, C, E, and G. That is the total surplus. The consumer surplus is A, B, producer surplus is C, G, and E goes to the government. So that's total surplus. Well, what happened to these two little triangles here? They are called deadweight laws. They are a loss due to tax distortion. When tax is imposed, tariff is a tax that creates inefficiencies, and there is a loss. D is a loss from overproduction. In other words, the marginal sellers who enter the market are not exactly the most efficient ones. They are only in the market because they are protected by the tariff. So this area D is a loss of surplus due to overproduction. Area F, the other little triangle here, is a loss due to underconsumption. Remember, the marginal consumer falls off the market when price goes up. People who could have consumed this are no longer consuming it because the prices have gone up. So that is deadweight loss, D and F. Let's look at another trade barrier, import quotas. Import quotas. Import quotas are the quantitative limit on imports of a good. Mostly has the same effect as a tariff. It raises price reduces quantity of imports, reduces buyers' welfare, increases sellers' welfare. In other words, import quotas has basically the same effect as tariff, except there is no revenue that the government collects. So it creates profit for the foreign producers of the imported good who can sell them at a higher price. The government is not collecting tariff though. Now, let's look at some arguments for restricting trade. What are some of the arguments? Remember, trade is a hotly contested issue in society. Some people like it, like producers. Some people don't like it, like trade unions who are trying to protect workers. So, the jobs argument. Trade with other countries destroys domestic jobs. Yes, domestically, some producers will drop off because they can't compete. Free trade creates jobs at the same time it destroys jobs. That is true. Total unemployment does not rise as import rise because job losses from imports are offset by job gains in export industries. That's a jobs argument. And as you can see, the history of trade here in the United States, we are having a trajectory of more imports. There's quite a bit of trade deficit over the years. The last time we had the balanced trade was in the 1960s. And as the world become more and more globalized, United States imports more and more as a percent of GDP, and the exports does not quite keep up. What about national security argument? The industry is vital for national security and it should be protected from foreign competition to prevent dependence on imports and could be disrupted that could be disrupted during wartime. When there are legitimate concerns over national security, but producers may exaggerate their own importance to national security to obtain protection from foreign competition. So, what about infant industry argument? New industries need temporary trade restriction to help them get started. Okay. Difficult to implement in practice because you don't know who is an infant industry and how long will it take before the industry mature. The temporary policy is hard to remove. Once it is in place, it is very difficult to go back and remove it. Protection is not necessary for an infant industry to grow, so it is not exactly a very good argument. Unfair competition argument. Producers argue their competitors in another country have an unfair advantage. For example, due to government subsidies, increase in total surplus for the country. We should welcome imports of low-cost products subsidized by their country's taxpayers, good for consumers. The gains to our consumers will exceed losses to our producers, as we have seen. What about the protection as a bargaining chip argument? Trade restrictions can be useful when we bargain with our trading partners. The threat may not work though, because they might call a bluff. What do the experts say? Refusing to liberalize trade unless partner countries adopt new labor or environmental rules is a bad policy because even if the new standards would reduce distortions on some dimensions, such a policy involves threatening to maintain large distortions in the form of restricted trade. Let's see what they say. 49% agree, 20% are uncertain, 26% disagree. Case study, trade agreements and the World Trade Organization, WTO, unilateral approach to achieve free trade, remove its trade restrictions on its own, Great Britain in the 19th century case, China and South Korea in recent years. What about multilateral approach to free trade? Reduce its trade restrictions while other countries do the same. The example of NAFTA and GATT. North American Free Trade Agreement, which was signed by President Clinton in 1993, lowered trade barriers among United States, Mexico, and Canada. GATT, General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, is a continuing series of negotiations among the world's countries with the goal of promoting trade. GATT, the US helped found GATT after World War II in response to the high tariff imposed during the Great Depression. It successfully reduced the average tariff among member countries from 40% to about 5%, and it is enforced by WTO. In 2015, to 162 countries, which is more than 97% of of world trade, belong to WTO. Advantages of the multilateral approach. There's potential to result in freer trade than unilateral approach. It reduces trade restrictions abroad and at home. Political advantage. Producers are fewer and better organized than consumers and greater political influence. Summary. A country with export the country will export a good if the world price of the good is higher than the domestic price without trade. Trade raises producer surplus, reduces consumer surplus, and raises total surplus. A country will import a good if the world price is lower than the domestic price without trade. Trade lowers producer surplus but raises consumer and total surplus. A tariff benefits producers and generates revenue for the government, but the losses to consumers exceed these gains. Common arguments for restricting trade include protecting jobs, defending national security, helping infant industry, preventing unfair competition, and responding to foreign trade restrictions. Some of these arguments have merit in some cases, but economists believe free trade is usually the better policy.